So this is Kieran Paul from New Street Culture, and I'm here interviewing Sham, also known as Curly Thug on social media. Now, we've got Sham here today because she posts consistently calls to action and knowledge surrounding revolution, resistance, race and gender via both her personal platform and her book club page. Her A is for activism, more than a book club, the new vanguard, Birmingham based. Humanity, community and love is at our core. So what we wanted to understand was, why is Malcom-X's presence on Marshall Street significant to you?
I think what's particularly interesting is that many Birmingham residents don't actually know that 9 days before he was assassinated by the CIA, Malcom-X actually came to Birmingham to visit, and he was on this very road. And it kind of reflects to, I guess, a history of racial tension within Birmingham, because we like to pretend in the UK in particular that we live in this post-racial world, but we don't. In this road in particular, a year before Malcom-X visited, the Conservative MP Peter Griffiths won the seat, and his actual campaign slogan was, if you want an N-word for a neighbour, vote Labour. So his particular stance was based on racism, and he won on that. And racial tensions in particular were so deep at that time that white residents in particular were calling for those who had money to buy up the houses from the council to make an all-white area. So at the same time, Avtar Singh, who was an Indian Labour union and worked for a trade union, invited X to come to Smethwick in particular, have a drink, and kind of understand that the same racial tensions and divisions that exist within the US also exist in Birmingham.
What I also want to understand then is, what feeds your desire to become a community organiser?
I wouldn't particularly call it a desire as such. I think it's more of like an innate call to action. And I think for anyone who was raised, I guess, in a particular socialist family, or my whole family are full of communists, is our main mantra is based on 5 words: all power to the people. So it's consistently knowing that people power first, a collective sense of organizing all together is what's going to win our power back from, I guess, the elite that control the majority of the world.
So how has the city inspired or supported you to do this?
It's a bit bizarre because I think my earliest example of organizing within the city was actually at school. And when I tell a lot of people I went to Hillcrest School, they're like, "Ee," like Hillcrest, ee. But I remember it was like year 10, and this was like when my political awakening was starting to happen, and it was a 2-minute silence at the time, and I was just like, I just came to school that day and I was like, I'm not doing it. And I went to the black and browns girls at the time, and I was like, are you guys taking part? Because I'm not. And they were like, you know what, we're not going to honor soldiers that were killing us. And it was like this collective thing. And then, you know, we got in trouble by the school. The other white students that were at the school were really upset. I remember one girl was crying because she was telling me that her cousin was in Iraq and we weren't honoring him. And it's really ironic because my cousins were in Iraq and he was dishonoring them by killing them. And then when we actually look, I guess, at the history of Birmingham, again, a lot of young activists in Birmingham don't know Birmingham has this long history of resistance. So if you go back to 1791, the Priestley riots, where religious dissenters at the time wanted to, I guess, expel the monarchy because they were like deeply inspired by the French Revolution at the time, and they wanted to gain their civil rights. And that was crushed in Birmingham. And then 200-300 years later, you get the Handsworth Revolution, well, the Handsworth riots, as they like to call it, where a bunch of black and brown people in Handsworth stood up against the police brutality. So this has been like a continuous thing in Birmingham, from trade labor unions to miners to calls against Thatcher to calls against Israeli apartheid. Like, Birmingham is known to stand against injustice. So in so many ways it's inspired me. And then when you look at particular organizers of today, and I think it's really important to name call them in particular, you look at what Mo Salman is doing at Migrant Voice, you look at what Liz Clegg is doing at Mina Center, you look at Aliyah Hassana, who's curating all these amazing black festivals in the city for black creators. And then you look at the former owners of the Impact Hub, Emmy and Nikki, and now they own the Civic Square. But you have like a collective of really awesome people in Birmingham doing the work, and I'm just like a speck in it all. But they can't help but inspire me throughout.
How challenging has it been on this journey?
I suppose it is challenging because, one, you're not going to get all the jobs you want because your name's attached to these things. Two, you're met with resistance from, I guess, trolls. But again, because the mantra is all power to the people, like, that challenge is nothing to anyone who really wants to be about it, I suppose.
About resources, I'm particularly interested because apart from maybe councils or pulling together, how do you go about collecting the resources to sustain and continue the work that you do?
We've, like, with the book club in particular, we've done everything out of pocket. So it's only recently that we set up a GoFundMe for our page because we wanted to deliver actual vital community survival programs. But prior to that, everything was done out of pocket. When we hosted our documentary screenings and people couldn't afford to come, we flagged the cost for that because it's important to understand that if it's not accessible to the poor, it's neither radical or revolutionary, it's nothing. All you're going to do is basically be talking to the same academics again and again, and that means nothing. So up until recently, we have flagged all the costs from our own pockets from whatever work we're doing. But we've set up a GoFundMe, and I guess people are so like inclined and believe in our vision so much. We've been able to raise £1,800, which is incredible, like more than we imagined anyway. So the book club was set up to basically celebrate black and brown revolutionary writers and read and assess their books. And we made sure that we did it in Birmingham because, again, although Birmingham has this history of like resistance, I feel like there's like a disconnect of the younger generation in particular. And we just wanted a way to honor those that came before us and follow their footsteps. So even what the community programs that we want to deliver with A's for Activism, that's the blueprint of what the Black Panther Party already did and what Fred Hampton already did in Chicago, despite being killed for it. So the blueprint for liberation and for all things that's successful is already there, but we just have to follow it. And that's why it's important for us to read those particular works first, because without theory or without education, nothing else matters and nothing else is really worthwhile. Community organizer works for me because all my work centers around Birmingham. Yeah, we do some stuff internationally like what we did for Yemen, but I think the precipice of everything is making sure that we bridge the gap in Birmingham in particular, and we make sure that the elder generation who have been doing this for however many decades are seeing that the young people are going to pick up the baton and take up that work for themselves. And organizing, like community organizing in particular, works for me because it's just a bit less intimidating, I suppose.
You've mentioned a lot of people that have inspired you, but you also mentioned your family as well, and being from Iraq. So I was interested to understand, how does it feel today, and what are the realities of being an Iraqi living in Birmingham?
I think there's not many Iraqis in Birmingham anyway. Like, there's a lot of Kurdish people, there's a lot of Arabs, etc. But I guess actual Iraqis, like, there's very few and far between. I think that in terms of how it affects my identity, being a Brummie, etc., I suppose, like, many people don't really know about the history of Iraq and what has happened. Like, many people don't know it was the Garden of Eden, for example. It was a cradle of civilization. It was the first place where life and civilization even started. So I think that in particular, I guess, evokes some kind of power into me because there's a sense of pride of where I come from. I guess the sense of resistance also exists because, you know, from resisting US imperialism to British imperialism to dictatorships to monarchs, Iraqis have done that for centuries now, for eons. So that's how that particularly affects me.
You arrived here in 2004. So how does it compare today to in 2004 in terms of just how you feel about the city?
I mean, because I've lived in Ladywood for the longest, I'm starting to notice the like super insidious attempts at gentrification of my area. So because it's really close in proximity to town, they understand that there's like a huge influx to be made of money, of rent, especially in the area. So I'm noticing the attempts of drawing these like apartment complexes, etc. And I remember I had a conversation with someone who lived in my area, and they were like, oh, but isn't this going to be an inherently good thing because it's gonna make the area look a bit pretty. And I was like, not if it's at the expense of our people here, and everyone's gonna be kicked out because they can't afford the ridiculously expensive rent prices. So I think with Birmingham, again, because they're trying to build the HS2 line now, knowing that there's like a huge change that's happening, and it's not for the better, and it's definitely going to be off the exploitation of black and brown people in the area.
I'd like to understand your opinion on which spaces you believe could benefit from change most urgently in terms of healthcare, education.
All of them. All of them. Again, like, I know that sounds super leftist or whatever, but I suppose we start with education first, because the curriculum is set out to create an inferiority complex within the people, especially black and brown people in this area. It's set out to kind of brush British imperialism with a really pretty stroke of rainbows and sunlight, and we build train tracks for these people, so what does it matter that we killed hundreds and millions of people, etc. And you know, there's a really, really important quote by Audre Lorde saying, where she says, the matter's never going to give you the tools to fight them back with. And in that same regard, we can't really expect their education to be something that's going to benefit us, because it's completely distorted of what's actually really happened. So I suppose you start with education, but the healthcare system doesn't work for people. You know, we're seeing black and brown people being disproportionately affected by COVID.
So what vision do you have for the future of Birmingham's communities?
I think, as cheesy as it sounds, but liberation, social welfare programs that actually work for people, the growing rates between the poor getting poorer and the rich getting richer, that to be completely eradicated. Complete class equality is what I'd call for first, because with class equality and with racial equality, you're going to get everything else that falls in line. So that's my best vision for Birmingham. If that is a bit too hopeful, I suppose, I'd say more money in like the community organisers that I mentioned previously to deliver vital programmes that this council and this government never will.
You said you lived in a few different places prior to arriving in Birmingham as well. So on a global aspect, how do you think we can get that type of change on a macro level?
Revolution.
What does that mean to you? What does revolution mean to you when you say that?
Again, I don't really think I can say what I want to say.
Be frank.
It just means like complete upheaval of the current system that we have right now. Like it's really interesting, because again, I had this conversation with a friend a couple days ago, and the same way all our oppressors interlink and have contracts with one another that make billions of our exploitation, is the same way that all oppressed and marginalized groups have to band together and work together for their liberation. And you know, if we are talking about seeing change on a global scale, it can't be reforming what we already have right now. Like George Jackson has a really good quote where he said, you cannot reform fascism. Reforming fascism is only fascism, like diet fascism.
Okay.
So you can't change the system that we have in place without like a complete upheaval of it and complete destruction of it from the top down.
Going back to the spirit of Malcom-X then, what do you think his view would be on society at large today?
I can't really talk for him. That's a bit of an interesting one. I don't think I could really answer that. I wouldn't believe that he'd be particularly happy with the way everything looks, because again, racism and fascism has only become more insidious because it's been reformed and it's been given a happier face, etc.
How?
So, you know, with like the Democrats, for example, voting in a black president, you know, in spite of him being the first black president, you know, he deported far more people than any other president before him, dropped far more drones than all the presidents before him combined onto like black and brown people globally, killing kids in like weddings, etc. Supported Israel. Black unemployment was at an all-time high underneath him, incarcerating little Mexican kids because they're undocumented. Like, his oppression knew no bounds. It's that simple. But again, it's fascism light. By putting a black face into the White House, there's a familiarity complex with it. Yeah. And there's someone that you can potentially trust, when in all seriousness it was two sides of the same coin. And yeah, I suppose Trump's like repressive government is far more evil in the way that it presents itself, But his policies and Obama's policies are not that different, despite being opposition parties, etc. So segregation has only been given a new face, I guess, and that is like the prison industrial complex. So I couldn't imagine him being particularly happy with that. And then when you talk about the global scale, like everything's again become more insidious in the way that these companies are making billions off of the profit of marginalized and getting contracts with governments to do that. So I think he'd be very disappointed, I suppose.
It's that drive, like you've got that drive. Many people have been distracted by COVID, they've been shielding, they've been scared of interacting with society, just thinking about themselves and making sure they
I feel like now more than ever, like people have been like on it, because people have had no choice but to listen because they're at home 24/7 and they can't go to the clubs and they can't go out for a drink, etc. And I feel like now it's like created this like, I guess, innateness in everyone to like wake the fuck up. Like I'm seeing people who never cared about Palestine saying free Palestine. People who have never really understood that they had white privilege be like, okay, I need to disband this and I need to work with black liberation movements. Like, and this is like completely different to anything I've ever seen before. So I don't feel like people are more asleep now. I feel like they've woken up because they have no choice but to, because they're at home 24/7.
How has it affected you then? So, I mean, where were you at the moment when Boris announced the lockdown? How did it make you feel? And how's the journey been for you?
When he first announced the original lockdown, I was at a shisha lounge. I was smoking shisha and I was trying to make the most out of it at the time. And I guess how it made me feel, I think I was just like, my eyes just kind of rolled back because his reaction was so delayed and his lockdown was so like beta as well. Like it wasn't a serious stance against what was actually happening. And you know, he didn't introduce the measures that he needed to at that time till weeks after anyway. And I think the fine was something ridiculous anyway, so not a lot of people were listening to lockdown rules, etc. And what I was particularly worried for at the time was a lot, like I guess a lot of undocumented migrants in this city in particular. Like they rely on cash in hand jobs, and when their employers are shut down, they're not going to get that money because their employers are like, it's modern day slavery to an extent. They can't receive benefits from the government or the councils because they are undocumented immigrants, etc. So I was really worried about them because one, who was going to take care of them? Two, where were they going to get the money from? And three, were their substandard living conditions even bearable for such a long time being in lockdown? And then I was worried about my mom, because I guess she's a vulnerable person. And then I was worried about my dad because he was also vulnerable. But they held it together, so they made me feel particularly okay.
So look, you're thinking about everybody else, but I'm interested in you as well. How did you get through it? So you weren't worried about yourself?
No, not particularly. I think because I had like so many things to distract me at the time, because I still had to work throughout this. I've been working non-stop and we've thrown like so many events for AIDS for Activism, all on Zoom of course, but we've held so many different events. Like we've just done an anti-police and anti-prison workshop recently where a lot of people tuned in, so we've been super busy with that. And you know, at the same time handling like I guess this huge shift across the world where people are realizing this shit can't last anymore, or this stuff can't last anymore, kept me going anyway.
How do you feel about the Black Lives Matter movement?
I think first, I think it's not really places for non-black people to really talk about how they feel. Like they just need to be comrades to the movement and that's it. Like not take up space within it, elevate and lift black voices regarding it. So the actual Black Lives Matter organization in the UK, revolutionaries like Aliyah Hasina that I mentioned earlier, like these are the people that need to be platformed and listened to in regarding all this. But like there's been like a huge shift around the world. Like whereas before like people turned, I guess, a blind eye to police brutality and the unjust nature of racism in the US and how they treat black people there, and even how they treat black people here. Like Kingsley Burrell was killed by the West Midlands police here. It's not like an alien concept here. And because of COVID, I guess, luckily people have had no choice but to listen to everything that's going on. So they've been at home consistently taking in all this, what usually is traumatic and overwhelming news that people can just switch off usually. But now they've had no choice but to listen and I guess mobilize and act against it. So even when Birmingham's protest had 5,000 people show up, like that's the largest protest I've ever been to in Birmingham. The most that I usually go to has like 90 people there. And seeing everyone galvanized for Yemen as well now, and what they incorrectly understand as a humanitarian crisis, which is really a product of Western imperialism and Saudi aggression. But the intention is still there, and people want to do something, and people want to give their funds, give their money where it matters. So there's been like a huge shift globally, and I think now is like a stepping stone to something much more different than we've experienced in a pre-COVID world anyway.
Yemen has not really been covered in the media in the same way that other crises of that magnitude would have. So why do you think that is?
Because the UK arms Saudi Arabia for their aggression against Yemen, and they have made again billions off of the exploitation of brown people in that region. So the only reason they haven't really particularly covered the not even a conflict, a huge occupation, and the only reason they haven't really spoken about it is because the UK is absolutely guilty, a guilty party, and it has an umbilical cord, if anything, to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is the one that's obviously responsible for the aggression. So that's the only reason they haven't really covered it.